Welcome back to Next Normal. The session title, Personalization of Digital Experience at Scale, a Myth or Reality. I strongly believe this will be one of the best sessions of day two. And a great pleasure to welcome three extraordinary gentlemen today. First, we have Chetak Buaria from Merck. Hi, Chetak. How are you?
Hey, Dario. Good to have you. Good to be here.
Fantastic. Mark Benthin, the CEO of VIIHEALTH. Mark, same question to you.
Thank you, Dario. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. And Sudhir Mahakali from Sandoz. He is facing some small technical issues, but I'm confident he will be with us very, very soon. But I can reply for him, and he's also fine as well. So let's move forward with our first question, which we prepared for you, gentlemen. And this is, what are the current legacy models of personalization, and can they be scaled? Let's start with you, Chetak.
Thank you, Dario. I mean, for me, this is really a hot topic right now as we take our lessons learned of last couple of years into pandemic. There's this point around digital fatigue on one hand. On the other hand, how do we measure effectiveness of digital comes into play as well. And it all then boils down to that experience that you want to provide to the other side in the frame of personalization. And this is not just because we are now looking at it through a lens of digital/omnichannel. This urge is very much at the heart of any engagement between two human beings, right? You want to provide that personalized touch because there is the other side who is unique in its requirement, and you need to make sure that you tailor your offering to that. What has happened is that as we have evolved, the dynamics or level of complexity has increased. So when I started my career as a medical representative, and I take a lot of pride in saying that your field rep is the best personalization engine that one can get, because that's what goes as algorithm in a rep's mind to pull in all the resources that the organization has to offer to tailor to the need of that one individual customer that I'm about to meet. Now, this was nice and easy in my good old days where I was the only one engaging with most of my physicians, but that is no longer the case. So what has evolved is in this kind of a multi-channel world is the complexity. Now, again, what we see today, thanks to technology and a lot of support that comes from our tech partners in this journey, that I see a lot of personalization happening even at a scale through individual channels. So let's take, for example, website as a classical point. We all experience increasingly that there is some kind of a personalization or curation of the content in many websites, including pharma websites as well. And we know how to crack that into individual channel domain. Where the real challenge is to drive that cross-channel personalization, because the journey of a physician from awareness to advocacy doesn't start and end with one channel. So how we make sure that we drive that personalization through different channels that are touching to that person. But let me pause there and would love to hear from my fellow panelists as well to get their thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Chetak. Very nice setup of the stage and introduction. Let's move forward to you, Mark.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I think it's interesting that the approach that we're taking, personalization, there is no right answer. There's only many answers that are close to being right. And a lot of times in the industry, I think the discussion and the data definitions, or the definitions around data, are changing. We used to talk about data as being only the output of what we're seeing and measuring. But I think there's a movement now to understand content as data, different modules of content, the description of that content, or the metadata that was discussed in the last session, as another form of data. And what you're referencing, Chetak, is is we're not just gathering and then delivering different forms of data, but we're also relying on a hypothesis. The hypothesis in the past was made by we're interacting live, we've got a certain understanding, we've got certain knowledge and information we'd like to share, and we bring some statements forward, and we gauge based on the response how well that went and how far we should go with our next conversation, right? Everything was about hypothesis, an offer of information, and then a reaction to it, and then a measurement and continual. We just did that as human beings. But ultimately, it's the same approach now, but needing to take into account data across, as you mentioned, multiple channels, the modular content or the need to automate the construction of the customer experience on that customer's behalf. So trying to make that as programmatic as possible or as automated as possible, and then be able to work the hypothesis, because it's only through that we're able to measure the overall personalization impact or effort and response, and then stepwise bring it forward to down the garden path to something where we've got slightly better orchestration, different hypotheses, and can eventually lead to more of a modular type system. But I think it's a very interesting approach, and there is no single right answer to a personalized experience. And I think that's a baseline that we should just accept. We can get better and better, but we'll never be perfect.
Completely agree. Maybe we can say it in a different way, Mark, and this is there is a right answer to the right person, right? Which is actually personalization.
at a right moment, but then the next moment things will change.
Fully agree. Fantastic. Sudhir, let's hear your opinion about it.
Yeah, hi Dario. Hello, Chetak and Mark. Apologies for some connectivity issues, like Chetak mentioned, right? Perils of technology at work. So my VPN and browser were just not cooperating. So at least some quick troubleshooting enabled me to get in. Dario, I think this is definitely, as you mentioned, a key topic. And commendations to Chetak for bringing this, to the stage. So I thought a lot, Chetak, about this ever since our call, and there are two things I want to submit to you and the community, right? One is, right, does personalization of digital experience at global scale exist across industries, right? And the answer you will see is an emphatic yes, right? And so then comes the question, right? In the context of pharma, right? Where are we, right? And I tend to agree that the fact that the subject has been kind of floated that it's a myth seems to indicate that we are far off from getting where we need to be, simply because, right, it is since COVID, it's a shift towards hybrid and digital, right? So maybe the reason for our slow uptake on this has been the traditional face to face kind of channels, right? And you will also note that in traditional face to face, right, as you said early on in your career, you started, personalization does exist, right? You know your HCP, you know what the HCP's needs are. You tend to go in and you always are making sure that the feedback loop from your experience is factored into the next encounter, next session, right? So it's really therefore bringing what other industries have been doing, right, along with the shift, right, in a pharma context to hybrid slash digital, makes it little bit the idea being a myth because of you're caught unawares and all of that. Now, with respect to the solutioning aspect, right, to make this a reality, Chetak and Mark, I think there are two aspects that I want to differentiate, right? One is, as Mark mentioned, right, content effectiveness, right? And what content are you pushing to what channels, right? Those aspects, right, are pretty much traditional. I would just say that those are familiar concepts. The unfamiliar concept is two aspects, right? One is letting go of your traditional face-to-face approach and embracing digital. That's a mindset slash change management slash cultural issue for an organization, which is not to be underestimated. And the second part, right? So the sooner you appreciate digital hybrid is here to stay, and your role, as a medical rep is an orchestrator, is going to be really key for, the organization and the individual at hand, right? And the second part is, again, to Mark and Chetak's point, right, about infrastructure, right? You have infrastructure, content pushed across infrastructure, right? And the infrastructure could be data infrastructure, AI infrastructure, right? And from the standpoint of reach, right? Your channel infrastructure and all of that, right? So really, you want to be at a point right now where your concept, right, whatever is your solution concept, right, infrastructure plus content, is working in a localized setting, and then kind of amplifying it, across markets, across regions, to achieve global scale. So those are my 2 cents, really, right? We should not tend to think of this as a technology problem, because there is a strong change management angle that kicks in, which is, if not the most important one, because you are actually having to counsel the medical rep that your a job is safe. Is just that the demands of your job have increased, right? From being just a person who is looking at interactions to an orchestrator.
Thanks a lot, Sudhir. Let's move forward to the next question. Key pillars and how to achieve personalization as a challenge, but also as the ultimate goal for our field force. Let's start with you, Mark, this time.
Well, just taking off of what Sudhir just mentioned, I think the rep as true orchestrator, we can go further than the current definition. One of the areas that we've worked quite a lot on over the last year and a half, 2 years, has been video personalization and being able to enable representatives or others to actually deliver a part of the message, not just live when they're in a synchronous discussion, as we are now, either in a live remote meeting or live face-to-face, but also when they're delivering a message or an update asynchronously, let's say after an event or after a discussion. And can they do that in a hyper-personalized manner at scale, in a compliant manner? So it took us some time to solve all of those aspects of those issues. But we did do that and integrate it within its environment. And I think that's really interesting, because then it actually brings that rep forward, so that they're not simply watching digital happen. They are a part of it. And it is, to your point, Sudhir, it is an integral part of how they move forward and become even more valuable in the future. So there's some interesting aspects there. And I think that also leads to better data from a KPI perspective that can also be rolled back into the rest of the channels that people are using. At the end of the day, there's been a huge investment in the infrastructure around KPIs and finding out not just what works or how many of something has happened, but sort of answering that question of, so what? So we did these emails, we sent this material, we got a certain amount of open rate, but why does that matter? How are we moving the needle for those particular individual physicians or physician groups along the adoption chain to a point where they are further and they understand the treatments better, the patient situation better, whatever it might be that the goal is for them to understand. And we need to make sure that we measure that effectively. So we're not just counting noses, as someone in my past used to like to say. We're actually understanding what those counts of those noses actually mean in the overall. So being able to apply that across the channels is an important point from the KPI perspective.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Sudhir?
Yeah, so Dario, I think a couple of notes here to kind of second Mark's note about KPIs, right? So obviously there's infrastructure, there's content, but the process aspect, right, is really key, right? So for a global scale adoption, right, you need to have a global performance KPI, right? Which typically a lot of companies have, right? That's that's actually based on current state process. So the important note is that, if your new normal in 3 years is digital hybrid, right? And your KPI need to follow that 3-year normal, right? Which means that, there is qualitative and quantitative KPI that needs to be considered, right? A colleague of mine who is like a, devil's advocate with respect to digital experience, right? His question to me is, when you have, digital experience, you want to be able to quantitatively measure whether the digital experience is as good as the personal face-to-face experience, right? Does your digital experience suffer, right? That's one aspect. So you need to have some KPI around it, because it's important to Mark's point, right? What are we watching out for? Is the, in the journey to personalization, hopefully we are not missing out on the experience suffering and becomes more traumatic for the recipient. So that's one. Companies do not have that, right? So to have a new normal, right, in terms of KPI towards digital experience qualitatively to capture that is a tough one, right? So I think it's important that apart from infrastructure and content, you also need to get your process and performance KPI right towards the hybrid, kind of normal, which is a 3 years hence story. So that's also very important. And then you are arming your medical rep with the information to see how he or she is performing, right, with digital interactions, right? Because they are monitored by KPI and they like to have the numbers tell them, right, how they are performing. So you need to have that framework in place. Otherwise, it's going to be very confusing for the rep to, calibrate, how to orchestrate.
Thanks a lot, Sudhir. Chetak.
I mean, I agree with all the points that both Mark and Sudhir have made. There's just one piece that I would like to bring to the attention here, often ignored, but in my opinion, has the master key to drive personalization is the consent. Now, for me, consent you get from HCP is the currency that you need to deliver personalization. If you don't have that currency, whatever fancy technology and everything that you have is for nothing. And that's where you have biggest pain point and the change management effort, and you need the other side to be a willing party. And that also brings a sense of owner responsibility rather on pharmaceutical companies as well, that we don't abuse this currency as well, is a sense of responsibility. There is, of course, a legal and regulatory aspect to it, which forces us to be responsible, but that there is also this moral dilemma, is that, okay, if someone has given me that consent, how do I be respectful as well, not to abuse it? Just because I have a consent doesn't mean that I start flooding the person with emails. And we all experience that in our personal lives. So for me, that's the critical piece, and how we get that right is the one point. And then even some of the back-end technological aspects and infrastructure aspects that were very well explained by Sudhir. So that's how I will wrap up the topic.
Thank you, Chetak. In meantime, we received an interesting question from Fabian, which is, are you engaging in personalization concepts on third-party platforms? If so, how? Who would like to go first? If anyone wants to go.
Go ahead, Sudhir.
Yeah, go ahead. I have a note on this, but I fully agree with you, Chetak, on your, the master key is definitely consent and dealing with consent in an intelligent manner. Go ahead and I'll follow you.
No, and personalization on third-party platform, I mean, yes, could be possible. Some of the challenges will still be valid. You cannot bypass them, what we discussed. But at the end, I mean, it reminds me of a cartoon I just saw the other day, where someone is asking a CEO of a company how customer-centric your company is. And the answer was, yes, we have 24/7 chatbot, which customers can use to get all the queries answered. And that's not customer centricity. That's not personalization. Yes, you could outsource that to a platform, but will that move the needle from a customer experience perspective? I'm not sure. And that actually is, in my opinion, a pain point. At least as operating managers in the organization, we often encounter this temptation when we work with third-party agencies that yes, they have smart ideas and creative strategies, which is nice and beneficial, but then they start bringing tools and platforms which are completely disconnected from the rest of ecosystem. And for me, it goes back to the point that I was making in my opening remark, is that there's no one channel today that is exclusively interfacing with my customers. There are multiple channels, and if I have part of that coming from one vendor, another coming from another vendor, and if they are not talking to each other, how do I drive that personalization is the challenge.
Fully agree, Chetak. Sudhir, Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, so, Mark, I'll want to kind of give a couple of cents if you allow, and then hand it over to you. Is this okay, Mark?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Sudhir, but I guess the information was around third-party platforms. At the end of the day, if I go back to the original statement, we're talking about data, and the data that we gather, the data that we deliver, and the hypothesis under which we are sending that data. Obviously, consent is a backdrop, and I like to think of it like everything is voluntary. We are asking the physicians to participate, and at any moment, if we're going too far or we have not done things properly, then we will hear about it, and they will vote with their computer mouse or their phone in some way, and either refuse to participate or simply sign off. At the end of the day, the systems, whether they are on third-party environments or on company-owned systems, should be able to help us deliver that right message to the right individual in approximately the right time or context. So we have that as a baseline. I think it's very important that we make sure we see a lot of our clients that are still, they have all the right principles, they have lots of the right systems, they have many of the right approaches strategically, but when push comes to shove, it tends to be a large format, long format content that's being delivered in a particular channel, and that's it. So they're missing the opportunity to actually apply this across these third-party channels, some of them, and they're missing the opportunity to break up the content into smaller bite-sized chunks that are more modular and could be perhaps tagged slightly differently for future referencing and personalization. I think there's still many campaigns that are being executed where the third party that's involved is not delivering the right level of data back. And that seems to be a simple baseline that we could clear up quite quickly as an industry, just to simply not allow that anymore, unless the third party has the appropriate consent and participation and so on to deliver the right level of data that is necessary to continue to feed the machine, right, in terms of knowledge and growth. It's really not worthwhile using it anymore. And I think we have to move to feel comfortable enough to move forward to that environment where we're gathering data, we're delivering information as data based upon a hypothesis, and turning that as often and as completely as possible within the cadence that's appropriate from a consent perspective. So that allows us to move forward, holistically, and certainly to get to a level of scale that is not mythical, it's actually reality, right? So that helps.
So do you
yeah, so I think couple of notes, right? So we use third-party platforms, right? You need to have whether you want to do a customer data platform, real-time streaming data, right, about your customers and building a profile, so to Chetak's point, right? You need to have some technology which is third-party in nature to support your implementation of your personalization strategy. So, where the data is stored, it could be in a third-party system. Where it is, used could be in a third-party system, right? There's a lot of infrastructure which helps you support. but the logic, right, to Chetak's point about, how you deploy personalization has to be company owned, right? I'm talking about the strategy and the logic, right, of, what you do with, the data that you store in, either your in-house platform or a third-party platform. How do you orchestrate, right? So for example, right, the concept of a decision engine and orchestrating, content over channels, right? That strategy, right, has to be yours, right? How it is delivered, whether it's delivered through your CRM or whether it is delivered through some third party orchestration engine, does not matter, right? I think what matters is that, the logic and the strategy is company owned, right? Because you're on the hook for, taking that consent and being responsible about it, right? So I think a third party cannot help you because it's really your, engagement with your HCP, right? So that's one note. So important thing is, right, having to have a profile, right, on, affinity, on digital affinity, and, having that profile to kind of tell you real time that things are shifting, changing is important. So personalization, Dario, two parts to it, right? One is the level to which you're going to go, right? There is a personalization at a stereotype level, right, where, you are improving your reach and frequency to untapped HCPs and you're bringing them into the common denominator. And then you have digitally savvy HCPs who want a little bit more, right? And your personalization strategy is a little bit different for them, right? So I think it's important to kind of have a segmentation around, personalization strategy for, folks that are not comfortable versus folks that are comfortable and want to go a little bit deeper.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sudhir. We are actually left with a couple of minutes. And so I would kindly appreciate a very short answer on my following question. This is, how do you deal internally and from experience with creating the ultimate and individual experience journey for our HCPs and stakeholders? Who would like to go first?
Yeah, maybe quick couple of points from my side, and this is where the myth part of the title comes in, right? And myth along with scale. So yes, you can drive personalization in a controlled environment, but typically for a large company that we have multiple countries as footprint, that's where the challenge comes in. To adapt that personalization engine to local regulations is one. Also, I mean, if I'm implementing personalization in a startup, I have a clean slate and I will design it, of course, much better than a organization with long legacy behind. So to drive that change is another challenge when you want to do it at a scale. And the last point, we talked about agencies and pros and cons of that. The last point I would add here is internal capabilities. How we take the organization together on this change journey. Sudhir was mentioning about the devil's advocate that he has to deal with, how we make sure to also uplift organization's capability along the way.
Thanks a lot, Chetak. Sudhir, Mark, short answer since we
Yeah,
are.
so, I think for me it's discipline and governance, right? I think you can't get to global scale without having a discipline, wanting to do it right, and scale, is coming from governance, right? To have federated governance. So I would add those two additional points to Chetak's remarks.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Sudhir. Mark, you're muted.
Sorry, yes, and just to round it out, I think from any situation, whichever any company is in today, obviously there's a infrastructure evolution that will happen over time, but one doesn't need to wait for perfection. For example, personalization, and bring it back to the representatives, really helping them from the personalization orchestration that they can do today. And we think that video is a fantastic tool that has been underutilized. Even in any context, in any company right now, can really help drive the end result of that experience to be much more personalized. So as the systems come into place, those will be able to take more advantage and drive it forward. So there's no reason to wait. Things are ready now to take advantage of whatever situation is currently live at the individual company.
So let's scale personalization. I will finish with that. Thanks a lot. It was a great discussion. We also received a couple of questions in the chat section. So if you have time, please reply on them. I think some questions are quite nice and good. So once again, Chetak, Sudhir, and Mark, thanks a lot for joining us, and see you soon in May in Dubrovnik as well. Take very good care.
Thank you, guys. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.